Sewing swimwear. Swimwear sewing patterns from AngelaKane.com. Here is a selection of swimming costumes I have made up from my sewing pattern number 206. The secret to making great swimming costumes is to buy the right sort of fabric and to learn appropriate sewing techniques. Choosing the right stitch for stretch and appearance is the key. Here I have used a cover stitch machine, but I will show you that you can achieve identical results on a sewing machine using a twin needle. The double stitching encases the elastic around the leg edges and gives a really neat finish, and the gusset lining is also neatly encased. There are some wonderful prints available for swimwear. You can't go wrong with stripes and spots for the beach. Of course, plains will always be popular. I like this chocolate brown. The back here is cut higher than the pattern. You can also make it a lot lower if you like. And of course black. Everyone needs a black swimming costume. So get yourself some great swimwear fabric and try out my classic swimming costume pattern. This is a PDF sewing pattern for AngelaKane.com members. Swimming costumes look great made up with contrasting fabrics. Look for coordinated prints. These dots would be wonderful for a two-piece, and I will be adding two-piece swimwear patterns soon. I love this geometric print. I've been a fan of this shade of green for a while, and this will go well with garments I already have in my collection. Lycra is probably the most used fabric for swimwear. It is seriously stretchy, but it is also flattering as it holds you in and gives you good shaping. Lycra stretches the same amount in both directions, and it usually stretches to a maximum of 1.5 times. Test your fabric by picking up a single layer in the middle, not along the edge. If you measure 12 inches, it will stretch to 18. And again across the fabric. Make sure you are testing along the straight grain. This geometric print is a good guide for a grain line. The maximum stretch is the same. This colour is delicious. I'm looking forward to making it up. 1 metre or 1 yard of fabric is ample for all sizes and in most of the usual widths. You'll probably have some over in the width to make accessories. Here is my sewing pattern number 206. You can download it in sizes 6 to 22, and it's very easy to print on A4 or letter-sized paper. Always print off the test page first and measure the grid, which must be 1 inch by 1 inch, measuring across the whole page. This pattern has just 3 pieces. Then comes the pattern itself. My patterns really are the easiest you will find online, because I draft separate layouts for both A4 and letter, and you won't find those annoying lining up marks. Just butt the pages together. There is no trimming and very little waste. Each size is drafted separately as well. Columns have numbers and rows have letters. Use some weights and tape together. It takes less than 5 minutes to assemble an Angela Kane PDF sewing pattern. So here is the complete sewing pattern. This pattern has the seam allowance included. If you prefer to work with a net pattern, then just cut along the stitching lines. So here are the 3 pieces. The gusset lining, the back piece and the front. You can modify the back neckline, make it very low for the beach or higher for serious swimming. Because of the nature of Lycra, the length of this pattern is reduced to 85% of the true body measurement. The gusset lining is cut without seam allowance. When the back and front are stitched together at the crotch seam, the gusset lining is basted in place and is neatly encased in the seam allowance of the leg. We can now cut out the fabric. I've laid out my pieces across the width. I use weights rather than pins. It's much quicker. Anything will do. Here I'm using curtain weights and washers. The length is running this way. This is your straight grain guide, which is parallel to the selvage. Clip these notches as you cut out. You can use the notches as a guide for matching larger patterns. Don't worry too much about matching a print such as this. For the gusset lining, use something like cotton t-shirt jersey. Something soft and stretchy. Remember, we cut this out without seam allowance. Once your pattern is cut out, don't forget to mark all your notches. Just one snip halfway into the seam allowance is all that is needed. Lycra is very easy to sew, and although you will see most commercial garments sewn together with overlocking and cover stitch, your regular sewing machine can produce identical or even better results if you have the know-how. So let's talk stitches. If you are stitching Lycra for the first time, it is worth using up some offcuts to test your stitches. This is my preferred stitch for seams in Lycra. 2 rows of machine stitching with a slight zigzag, and then trimmed afterwards. It's very neat, and there is plenty of stretch. Here we have 1 row of slight zigzag and a full zigzag next to it. This is useful if you think your jersey is loosely stitched and prone to running. Again, trimmed afterwards. In practice, of course, you would use a matching thread for these seams. For turnings and for encasing the elastic around the legs, the twin needle is ideal. Here I have used woolly nylon for the bobbin thread. This is also known as bulk looper thread and does what it says. It softens and covers raw edges well when overlocking, but is also great with twin needle stitching. Try hand winding the woolly nylon on the bobbin for best results. A nice stretch turning. And here is a turning using just the zigzag stitch and ordinary thread in the bobbin. This stitch works really well on swimwear. Perhaps it is a little less like a commercially made garment. It has plenty of stretch, and again, trim the seam after sewing for best results. You can also use woolly nylon in the bobbin, so that is an insight into your choices for stitching. It is always worthwhile testing stitches, threads and sewing machine needles so that you will have trouble-free sewing. Garment construction. We have here the front and back. The front is longer at the crotch. The first seam to stitch is this crotch seam. It's a short seam and you probably don't need to pin it. Use ballpoint pins with jersey, it does make a difference. I shall use my preferred stitch, the 2 rows of narrow zigzag. It's not so necessary to press the seams on this sort of jersey. Trim the seam to 1 millimetre or so from the stitching. Now is the time to add the crotch lining. Line it up carefully . Pin all round. The raw edges will be neatly encased within the leg turnings. We don't normally need to neaten these edges, as this jersey will not ravel. If you have a basting stitch on your sewing machine, use it. I find it fixes much more securely than hand basting. Right, that will stay in place while we get on. So, with right sides together, pin the shoulder seams. And join the side seams, matching the notches. So again, 2 rows of narrow zigzag. And trim back to 1 millimetre or so from the stitching. So the seams are stitched and trimmed. Next we are going to finish the neckline and armhole edges. Although I'm not pressing these seams, it's usual to make sure that seams lie towards the back. I'm going to use a 4 millimetre twin or double needle for stretch fabrics. For an extra neat finish, clip the seam allowance at the seam line, just short of the first row of stitching. And have the seam allowances lie in opposite directions. This does wonders to reducing bulk when seams cross. I am machine basting the neckline 5/8 of an inch turning in place. Later on you may be happy to skip this step and sew the turning from the right side without basting. Doing it this way makes it much easier to sew around the curves and guarantees good results. Try not to stretch as you stitch. If you haven't got a basting stitch on your sewing machine, use the longest stitch and loosen the tension a little. As you approach the curve of the neckline, you can stretch a little so that the seam allowance remains flat as you sew. Do your best to keep the seam width even. So continue all the way round. Keep your basting an even distance from the fold. We will be using this as a guide when we sew from the right side. So this is now basted. We are going to stitch either side of the basting using the twin needle. Check your sewing machine manual for twin needle threading. It's best to start stitching in an inconspicuous place. For the neckline, I usually start just behind the shoulder seam and just behind the side seam for the underarm. Guide the basting into the centre of the foot. And I finish stitching by overlapping an inch or so, which is enough to stop the stitches coming undone. You can use the useful product fray check or sew in ends if you prefer. The neckline and armholes are stitched, so take out the basting. That's not such a difficult job as the twin needle stitching lies either side, so the basting doesn't get caught up. Tweezers are really useful for this job. Once the basting is removed, trim back the seam allowance to 1 millimetre or so from the stitching. Just slide your scissors along without trying to get too close. You will find that after washing, this edge will look less and less like a raw edge, as the jersey is inclined to roll. If you look at manufactured swimming costumes and also underwear stitched using cover stitch, you will find that this cut edge finish is used, although commercial machines cut off the allowance during the sewing process, rather like an overlocker does. So that is the neckline and armholes finished to a very high standard. A nice finish on the inside. The curved neckline lies nice and flat. There's plenty of stretch. All the qualities needed in great swimwear. Now for the legs. Choosing elastic. I have a selection here. Firstly, here is this specialist swimwear elastic. It is supposed to be chlorine and seawater resistant. Personally, I don't much like working with it. It's rather too wide. So I will leave this for another video. I find regular elastic holds up very well. I've used this narrow prim elastic for swimwear before. This ordinary elastic from John Lewis is fine. I like this flesh colour. In fact, it feels softer than the white. I don't know why that is, as they are labelled the same. So this is the one I'm going to use. I find the easiest and neatest way to apply elastic is to machine baste it in place within the seam allowance and at the same time stretching the elastic a little as you go round. This makes top stitching with the twin needles from the right side very easy. So at the sewing machine, and using a basting stitch, place the elastic in position just before the seam line. Fold over the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Take a couple of machine stitches to anchor the elastic. Then fold in the seam allowance and baste, stretching the elastic slightly. You should try and stretch the elastic more around the back of the leg and only very slightly along the leg front. Push the elastic against the fold as you sew. Cut the elastic, leaving a little extra . When you get close to the starting point, trim the elastic so that it just overlaps the beginning. Tucking it inside the seam allowance. Take advantage of your free arm sewing machine if you have one. Slipping the leg over the free arm does make it a little easier. Getting started with the elastic in position is the hardest bit. Once you have anchored it with a few stitches, you are away. So again, remember to stretch the elastic a little more along the back leg than the front leg section. That is the second leg done. So for the final stitching, using the twin needle, sew as before. Feeding the basting stitch into the centre of the foot. Start your stitching at the crotch seam. Stretch the elastic as you stitch. As you reach the end, trim your threads and try and sew exactly over the beginning stitches. Returning to the flatbed, I'm stitching around the other leg. All that is left to do now is to remove the basting. Once the basting is removed, trim back the seam allowance to 1 millimetre or so from the stitching. The swimming costume is finished and I'm very pleased with it. The basting stages may be a bit of a chore, but the result is worth it. If you wanted to line this costume, use lycra lining. Treat the 2 layers as one and make in the same way. A racing back version would be a nice addition to my pattern collection.